Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 14th of January. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 690 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I'll introduce our guests for this afternoon, and then together we will take a look at the rest of the week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. France's newly appointed Foreign Minister, Stéphane Séjourné, met Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv yesterday on his first official visit abroad, vowing that Paris would maintain its support. Despite the multiplying crises, Ukraine is and will remain France's priority, Séjourné told the Ukraine's Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, at a new joint news conference earlier yesterday. Russia's Justice Ministry designated one of the country's most popular fiction writers as a foreign agent because of his opposition to Moscow's war in Ukraine. The historical detective stories of Boris Akunin, the pen name of the Georgian-born Grigory Chikhartishvili, used to be bestsellers in Russia before the authorities turned on him for what they said was his unacceptable anti-Russian views. A prominent liberal priest faces expulsion from the Russian Orthodox Church for refusing to read out a prayer asking God to guide Russia to victory in Ukraine. In a verdict published yesterday, a church court said that Alexei Yuminsky should be expelled from holy orders for violating a priestly oath. Ukraine suffered a massive Russian missile attack in the early hours of yesterday, its air force has said, adding that Moscow had fired some of the most fearsome hypersonic missiles. Air defences shot down Russian missiles in at least 5 regions across Ukraine, according to local officials from those provinces. However, no details were given on whether any targets were hit, and far less information about the attack than usual was provided by officials. Ukraine's Air Force warned during the attack that Russia had fired Kinzhal missiles, perhaps the hardest conventional Russian missile to shoot down, moving at several times the speed of sound. Russia, meanwhile, said it had destroyed all targets in a barrage of strikes on facilities producing ammunition and drones in Ukraine. This morning, the armed forces of the Russian Federation carried out a group strike against facilities of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, the Defence Ministry said in a daily briefing. It said it was targeting places producing shells, gunpowder and unmanned aerial vehicles. And President Zelensky will speak in person at the World Economic Forum in the Swiss town of Davos on Tuesday, according to the WEF's event programme. Forum President Børge Brende last week told reporters that President Zelensky would give an address during the event, while more than 70 national security advisors from around the world would on Sunday discuss ways forward on the Ukrainian president's peace plan. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this afternoon by 2 particularly special guests. Emma Harper stood for election as the SNP candidate for Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweeddale in 2015, losing out to David Mundell by just 798 votes. However, Emma was elected to the Scottish Parliament 1 year later as an MSP for South Scotland. Emma is now a member of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee, the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee. She's a member of 18 cross-party groups focusing on health and the well-being economy. She's still a registered nurse, a member of Scottish CND, and was past president of Dumfries Ladies Burns Club No. 1. Emma, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Good afternoon, Andrew. I'm doing very well. Had a nice recess, but we've hit the ground running again in our first week back following recess. So yeah, it's just piled on already.
That's good to hear, Emma. It's going to be a busy 2024, there's no question of that. We're also joined today by Greg McCarra. Greg is the Chief Executive of the Scottish Independence Foundation. He's the past convener of the SNP Trade Union Group. He's an executive member of the Scottish Independence Convention. Previously, he was an SNP councillor in West Lothian. He's a former trade union president. He was a Napier University lecturer and president of the EIS University Lecturers Association. Greg, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Fine, thank you. And hearing that list, I'm glad I've retired from most of it.
That just gives you more time to do more things, Greg. Thank you both for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland for the Full Scottish today. Now, our first item this afternoon is that tomorrow will be 100 days since the start of the conflict in Gaza on October the 7th. With the death toll at almost 24,000 Palestinians in Gaza, this week saw South Africa accuse Israel of genocide in the International Criminal Court. As protests against the Gaza conflict took place around the world yesterday, the Committee to Protect Journalists said the killings of journalists by the Israeli Defense Force must stop now. Now, during last night, the Israeli President Netanyahu, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said that no one will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anyone else. And this was a TV broadcast last night, and he was referring to Iran and its allied militias as the axis of evil. So, firstly, Greg, do you think, would most Israelis be happy that apparently Benjamin Netanyahu is going to ignore The Hague, he's going to ignore international law, and by implication, he's going to ignore an order from the International Criminal Court to cease fire?
Yes, I think a very large proportion, maybe even a majority, might think that way. I think they're deluding themselves. It's easy to get drawn into these things in a time of conflict. There often tends to be an inclination for people to rally around the leadership of the country because they see it as under attack. And then it sometimes utterly collapses, and people realise that actually it's the people who are under attack, and it's the government and the perpetrators of that attack. So there's plenty coming out from Israel suggesting that Netanyahu is under severe threat. I don't expect him to survive as Prime Minister. But that's a trivial consequence. The main consequence is for the people of Gaza and for the greater conflict that might come out of it. So this has got a long, long way to go. I'd like to say more on that a bit later on.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for starting us this afternoon. I'm grateful to you. Emma, to continue thinking for a moment about the International Criminal Court. Of course, the US is not a state party to the Rome Statute which created the ICC. The US participated in negotiations that led to the creation of the court. However, in 1998, the USA was one of 7 countries. It's an interesting list, which were China, Iraq, Israel, Libya, Qatar, and the Yemen, who voted against the Rome Statute and as a result are not members of the ICC. So do you think, thinking more broadly, Emma, do you think that the current conflict that we're seeing unfolding in the Middle East, does that just underline the failure of the world community since 1998 to secure these particular 8 countries, as members of the International Criminal Court?
Yeah, I mean, just what you've described there, Andrew, it is really interesting looking at the history from the 90s and the countries that are not participating in the ICC and what's unfolding not only in Gaza but in Yemen. And I know we're going to come to that, but I just can't believe there's any justification for killing innocent people, including women and children. I mean, we've seen what's unfolded in Gaza in the last 100 days, like bombing hospitals. There is no justification for that. And I used to work as an operating room nurse. And, we need the surgeons and the anaesthetists and everybody are really, really struggling to help look after people. And it's just this continued action of Israel. I know there are problems on both sides, but we cannot begin to even engage in peace or a peaceful process unless we get an immediate ceasefire. And it pains me and it concerns me because I feel pretty powerless that we can't do anything. But I just think we really absolutely need to be lobbying for a ceasefire so that we can start to see some kind of peace process engagement in Gaza. It's just really concerning to see what's going on. And again, we're at 100 days.
Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. And we should always be careful to contrast between the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the ICJ, which is the International Court of Justice, which sits in the Hague. But Greg, thinking of the politics a little bit more for a moment, we saw protests in 30 cities, I think, around the world yesterday, including in London and I think in Glasgow, pro-Palestinian protests again. Do you think there's 2 aspects to this? And I'm looking to your lengthy expertise in these matters. Do you think that the current protests against the war are making any headway in the UK? And I might ask you to reflect. Do you feel that protests in favour of peace and protests against war. Do they ever succeed? I'm struggling to think of any events in my lifetime where large peace protests have actually made a difference.
I don't think that the protests are going to change the current government policy, but because they are so widespread and people are paying attention and maybe getting behind the mainstream media news and maybe getting further information, that it might, instead of changing the views of government, it might be changing the views of the people themselves. I'm not even certain that that's going to have any effect in swings and votes in the coming months or anything of the sort, but longer term views. Let's have a wee think about what's happening in the ICC just now. And it's a case saying that South Africa is committing acts of genocide. And let's have a look at what genocide is. And it's committing acts against the intention to destroy or at least part destroy a whole nation or an ethnic group, a racial group, or a religious group. And includes things like forcibly transferring children into another group, or actually suppressing the birth rate of groups. Now, you might think in many ways that's Nazi Germany. That's the kind of horrors of then. No, it's the horrors of now, and maybe if people get a bit more aware of that, then it'll possibly, they might feel that their own governments are not acting properly. And if folk think it's not happening just now, one of the wonderful things that's taking place in here is that the international action has been brought by South Africa, which suffered from apartheid for so long. And the international community, including the good city of Glasgow, rallied to their defence to try and press the case for South Africa. And it was lovely that South Africa is the country that's taking this action. But what they're facing is a press which suppresses people's respect for international courts of any sort by referring to them as the enemies of the people, or UK courts for that matter, or Scottish courts for that matter, enemies of the people. That was a line used before and during the Second World War by Nazi Germany. And we get it in the British press now. So suppression, attempts by government to suppress the rights, respect for the due process of law, locally, nationally, internationally, and also trying to give one side of the argument and say, no, there's no genocide, whereby any interpretation of the definition, there most certainly is genocide. And more people, I think, are realising they're being, shall we say, gently misinformed, and maybe they should seek other information which is not coming from the standard normal sources. There's almost no proper balanced coverage of this coming, for example, from the BBC.
Thanks, Greg. Now, Emma, I wanted to look a little bit more at the point I mentioned in the introduction, which is with regard to the status and the circumstances that journalists are finding themselves in as they seek to report on this war. The latest journalists killed by the IDF were killed a week ago today. The killings of journalists Hamza al-Douda and Mustafa Turaya must be independently investigated, and those behind their deaths must be held accountable. The continuous killings of journalists and their family members by the Israeli army must end. Journalists are civilians, not targets, and that's the CPJ's Middle East and North Africa Programme Coordinator, Sharif Mansour. The IDF initially said on last Sunday that its aircraft struck a terrorist who operated an aircraft that posed a threat to IDF troops. However, later, its spokesperson described the incident as unfortunate, but said that using a drone in a war zone, it's a problem. So, Emma, do you think, does the fact that so many journalists have been killed in Gaza reporting on the war, does it tell us anything? Does it tell us perhaps about the IDF approach to the war, which is to kill anyone and to completely ignore whether or not they are civilians, let alone journalists?
Yep. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. The journalists are civilians and they're doing a job. They're trying to communicate what's happening on the ground in Gaza and in Israel so that we are then informed. I mean, Greg's just talked about the protests that are happening. And there's protests in Dumfries every Saturday against what's happening to innocent people in Palestine, and any journalist that is killed, and yes, they might say it's unfortunate, but I would absolutely urge that independent investigation is taken forward, because our journalists are absolutely, they're civilians, and we need to honour the fact that they are doing a job that is really, really difficult in dangerous circumstances, and they should not be targets in any conflict at all.
Thanks, Emma. And Greg, I'm going to give you the difficult task. I was going to look at this issue from the other perspective, if I may, because outrage has greeted a clip of a report on UK's Sky News earlier this week, and which has been widely shamed on social media. The video showed Sky News reporting on the death of Ruqayya Ahmad Ode Jahalin, who was killed by Israeli forces in a shooting near the Palestinian village of Beit Iksa in the central occupied West Bank on the 7th of January. The broadcaster's reporter stated, accidentally, a stray bullet found its way into the van, and that killed a 3 or 4-year-old young lady. Now, the Lib Dem peer Miral Hussein Etche was among those who condemned the footage, saying the reporter's use of passive language suggested journalism is finished. So, Greg, do you think is the relatively muted reaction to so many journalists being killed in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank, does that also tell us something about the way that journalists are regarded nowadays, and perhaps thinking of the way that Sky News were behaving? Is that any surprise?
It's been not uncommon in wars for journalists who don't report the story the way their employers wish them to report it, they're pretty well removed, sent elsewhere. Journalists have a very difficult line to walk. So some things I was going to say there. War makes rattling good news is a line that was used in the 1920s in starting wars, and that happened in the 1970s as well. Creating wars just for the sake of journalism, for the sake of news stories. I don't say this yeah, that's it. So I don't think that that's happening just now necessarily, but the language in here is quite remarkable. See the war in Gaza. Let's just take that in terms of language. What war? There isn't a war in Gaza. A war is a conflict between two countries, commonly heavily armed, able to fight against each other in similar terms. Otherwise, it's an extremely brief war because one gets crushed by the other overnight. This isn't a war. This is an extended occupation. Against, yes, Hamas started off with a fair amount of weaponry, and I'm not going to get into debate as whether or not they should have used it, other than to say, I don't like launching wars by any side, anywhere, ever. So I think that covers everybody. But the response to that looks like an attempt to drive the people of Gaza first from the north into the south, and then from the south into Egypt, and failing that into the sea. And I can't see any other interpretation. It's not a war. That's the wrong word for it. It's a prolonged attack and attempted, let me use the word again, genocide.
Thanks, Greg. A very good point, very well made. Thank you. And Emma, one last question, thinking about the journalism and the reporting around about this. Fresh analysis has found that the BBC's broadcasting output has prioritised Israeli deaths over Palestinian in its reporting. Research by Open Democracy found that in the month following the October 7 attack by Hamas on Israel, the phrases murder, murderous, mass murder, brutal murder, and merciless murder were used 52 times by journalists to refer to Israeli deaths, but never in relation to Palestinian deaths. And a separate study found that the BBC's online output is almost exclusively using words like murder to refer to Israeli deaths and not Palestinian. So, Emma, do you think, should we be worried at the way in which BBC and Sky News are reporting this conflict?
Well, you've just pointed quite clearly how the language that's used on whatever side is might be perceived as inflammatory in one regard for the like a pro-Israeli approach versus the fact that what we're seeing is innocent children being killed in this conflict. And I agree with Greg about this war is it's not a war when innocent people are basically fleeing for their lives. They're without any ability to protect themselves as well. So I based on what you're saying and the language that's used by our media, I would encourage people to be looking at the research from other people so that we can be better informed rather than from the main news of Sky and even the BBC. When it's analysed, as you're describing, it is really concerning about almost like the sides that are being taken instead of objective, open approach and objective language, which is basically that's what should be taken forward. So I would encourage people to be looking at the information that you're quoting based on what open democracy and added information is about how we analyse the language that's directly used, because we know people are influenced by what it is they hear. So I'd rather people hear the facts and the truth.
Thanks, Emma. As we know, the words matter. But let's move on now a little bit and look at a slightly wider context for the conflict in the Middle East, because I was going to discuss with Emma and with Greg whether the UK and US airstrikes on the Yemen will stop the attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, or could the outcome be an expansion of the conflict in the Middle East, perhaps even affecting the war in Ukraine, given Iran's support for Russia and given the impact that the attacks on shipping in the Red Sea have had on world trade. So, Greg, Maisa Shuja al-Din from the Sana'a Centre for Strategic Studies insists that the Houthis will not be deterred by Western attacks, but will see them as a gift, even a recruiting sergeant. She said that they have spent years fighting the Saudis, absorbing losses. She says that, if anything, the last week will make the Houthis believe they are no longer local players, but are regional players, legitimised in their own right for directly confronting America. So, and she said that in itself. So, Greg, do you think is that in itself an escalation of the conflict? Houthis and Yemenis now see themselves as actors in a regional war, not in a local insurgency, which was the conflict with Saudi Arabia.
Indeed. I've seen Houthis are saying that they're carrying out these attacks on Western powers because they do it out of solidarity for Palestine. Again, I'm not actually persuaded of that. This conflict has been going on for a long time, and certainly before the start of October, when Hamas launched their own attack, which began the current round of conflict. What's happening in Yemen, it's largely local politics being dressed up as international politics, and there's the attempt to kind of latch that onto other conflicts, and successfully as well, because if you start to broaden the conflict a bit, then other people feel threatened or get involved, and that is a broadening of it. And as they get involved, the people who don't like them and want to undermine them will come into the attack, but could get to the stage where, instead of using surrogates, that Iran became itself directly active in it. If we get to that stage, we're not just talking about conflict, we're talking about something bigger than just local conflict. As for what they're trying to achieve in this, I wish Scotland was independent. We had a role in trying to reduce conflict. We had political units involved in doing that, as has similar-sized but independent Norway, and that's maybe the role of small countries to try and do that rather than join in the conflict. The reasons for this, if you don't mind me continue, cut me off and bring all means. But it's fascinating in here. What we have is the UK. Supposedly, allegedly, its role in here is to try and protect shipping lanes to allow the movement of goods through the Suez Canal. Flashback, 1956. And by the way, the parliamentary Westminster leader of the SNP, in passing, mentioned this earlier on this week. Britain has a poor track record in conflicts in the Middle East. Throwaway line, nobody seemed to pick it up as far as I could see. Here's my pick-up on it. The Suez Wars in 1956, we had President Nasser had overthrown the government. He was then head of state. He nationalised the Suez Canal. That's quite legitimate for people to nationalise infrastructure within their own country. He did that. Britain and France, who jointly ran the Suez Canal Company, said, "Oh, no, we're not having that. We're going to take that." "No," said Nasser, "we'll bomb you," said Britain. and America had nothing to do with it. Now, isn't that interesting? Britain isolated itself in the international community, dropped from maybe being a first-rate, but certainly into at least a second-rate, if not a third-rate international power. As a direct consequence of that involvement, that could happen this time as well. So getting involved in things where you shouldn't be involved in for entirely the wrong reasons, all for the sake of trying to have a rattling good war, to stir people up in the country, get a bit of jingoism going, and enhance your vote for a forthcoming election, ain't a clever policy, and it kills people.
Thanks,
Wow.
Greg. Absolutely spot on. Emma, one other aspect here I was going to look at with you was I noticed that Turkey's President Erdogan said last week that the Houthis in Yemen are mounting a successful defence against the US and the UK. And he went on to say that the UK, Britain is trying to turn the Red Sea into a sea of blood. Now, that as ever, trenchant commentary from the Turkish president. But do you think, given Turkey's role in NATO, do you think is there a potential problem for NATO here with the UK and US undertaking military activities in the Middle East and being criticised so heavily by the Turkish president?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I know that our unelected Lord David Cameron was on Laura Kuenssberg's show this morning talking about this conflict in the Red Sea and the attacks on Yemen as being limited, necessary and proportionate. And it seems to me that like the UK are really quite quick to jump into military aid or military action when the economy is threatened, but what we're witnessing in Gaza is not the engagement and interaction that we need. So I'm really concerned that that the instability, the actions of the UK in line with the US, without even like any parliamentary engagement or discussion. I don't even think the First Minister of Scotland even got a phone call from the Prime Minister, even though they're claiming that Keir Starmer was notified of this cabinet decision. But the First Minister of Scotland, it wasn't Lord Cameron the one that said Scotland should lead and not leave when he took us out of the EU, and so it's complete hypocrisy what they say. And the sooner that Greg's right, if we were a small independent country, we would be able to have a voice and leverage about actions that should be taken or could be taken, whether it's involved with NATO or whether it's how we work with other countries, including the other conflicts that are going around. It's just everything is so unstable and concerning right now that this quick jump into military activity and in the Red Sea is something that it's really difficult for me to even comment on, because we, again, are powerless in Scotland because the First Minister isn't even informed of these actions by a UK government. And, the sooner that Rishi Sunak is out of there, the better.
Thanks, Emma. Greg, go on.
Just a quick point, Andrew. I think I agree with all that Emma said there. It would be good if Scotland could use its own voice to protest against this and to call for action to begin to end this conflict, and as we did with apartheid in South Africa very effectively. I hope the viewers of this are aware, but maybe not all are, that there had been moves at Westminster to stop that. To make it impossible, to make it illegal for people to call, for example, for boycotts or to condemn or to disinvest in any way in Israel and the projects of the government of Israel. And that bill passed in Westminster on Monday night. And it means that not only if we individually or as an organisation want to speak against what's happening in Israel and call for action, then we could be committing a criminal crime. It also means that councils in Scotland can't do that, and in fact Westminster will be able to intervene to block councils from taking action. So Emma talked about limited powers that we have. Their powers have been further reduced as of Monday of this week.
Thanks, Greg. That's a very good point that you're making there. Thank you. Emma, I was going to broaden this right back out again to conclude our discussion on the circumstances in Yemen at the moment. And I was going to ask you, and my apologies for the breadth of this, but I was going to ask you, it's reflecting on whether there can be peace without justice for peoples who are powerless and are dispossessed and in some senses might be regarded as being stateless. I'm thinking perhaps obviously I'm thinking of the circumstances of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. I'm thinking of the Yemeni people who've been under attack by Saudi Arabia for more than a decade. But I'm also thinking of the Catholic communities in the north of the island of Ireland and also of the people of South Africa. So, Emma, do you think what are the prospects for peace without justice for peoples like the Palestinians of Gaza and others who are powerless and dispossessed?
I think I don't know. I am not an international expert on any of this or peace negotiations or anything like that. But when we're having, people affected by conflict, there's, people who are innocent who were not making any decisions about it, but they are now the recipients of bombs and their houses being destroyed and their ability to have even food and water is affected. The people are so affected, and the prospects can only be, I suppose, changed for the people when a ceasefire exists, when we engage in peace and discussions, and then justice hopefully would be able to be achieved. Some of the work that I did previously was around the work of including women in peace process. There's a resolution 1325 of the EU that says that you must include women in the peace process, because women talk about then the schools and homes and clothes and education and the children, whereas in a military de-escalation or peace process, without women, it was about reducing bombs and reducing weapons, and taking landmines away. So in my work around the development of peace, it was really that, obviously first we need to do ceasefire and then enter into whatever work we can do to get prolonged peace, so that we can make sure that people have that, like, homes to go back to and support the re-engagement of people back into their own communities, and so that they can get justice out of a conflict that many innocent people, they didn't even start. They just get embroiled in this, and what we need to do is support any action that we can do to further peace and help people have some kind of sense of just getting on with their lives, because we know that we don't want war, we don't welcome war, nobody wants it. So we need to make sure that we help support whatever actions we can to take forward any peace.
Thanks, Emma. Whatever action we can, I think that's a very reasonable perspective to be taking. Thank you. Now, I'd like to move on to European politics now, because new research has found that adopting right-wing policies on issues such as immigration and the economy does not help centre-left parties win votes. A report said that centre-left parties that impose austerity lose votes, and the report pointed to the Labour Party in 2015 as an example. Voters tend to prefer the original to the copy, said Tariq Abu-Chadi, an associate professor of European politics at the University of Oxford and the co-founder of the Progressive Politics Research Network, which launched last week. Faced with a 20-year decline in their vote share, accompanied by rising support for the right, the far right, and occasionally the far left, social democratic parties across Europe have increasingly sought salvation by moving towards the political centre. However, the analysis, which was published on Wednesday, shows that centre-left parties promising, for example, to be tough on immigration or tough on public spending are unlikely to attract potential voters on the right, and in fact risk alienating their existing voters. Björn Bremer of the Central European University in Vienna said a survey in Spain, Italy, the UK and Germany, and larger data sets from 12 EU countries showed that since the financial crisis of 2008, fiscal orthodoxy had been a vote loser for the centre-left. He said social democratic parties that have backed austerity fail to win the support of voters worried about public debt, and they lose the backing of those who oppose austerity. He said centre-left parties that actually impose austerity lose votes. So, Emma, firstly, do you think, is it perhaps too late for Keir Starmer's current Labour project to look at this report and look at this data and perhaps change course?
Well, the data that you're quoting actually is really interesting. You know, people seem to think that Labour is like a left-sided of the centre party, but it looks like Keir Starmer is progressing more towards the right with his failure to actually commit to reversing any of the austerity policies of the right-wing Tory government that are even getting dragged more towards the right themselves with actions of other parties that are now emerging as well. So I think, you know, everybody thinks that Keir Starmer's got it in the bag for winning the next election, but you know, I can't see that that is going to help anybody in Scotland when they, you know, again, this is about power and control and ability over to choose our path in Scotland. You know, the SNP is a socially democratic, progressive party, and it looks like even Keir Starmer is taken a step to the right, and it is really worrying, because what you're going to get is just more of the same if we end up with Labour UK and then even more Labour seats in Scotland. They're not going to represent what the people in Scotland have said that they want over subsequent elections in Scotland. We're going to end up with just more of the same right-wing policies and austerity that we don't have any control over, especially when it comes to cost of living, energy, and our ability to, you know, choose our own path in Scotland. It's this look at what Keir Starmer's saying. He keeps talking about change. Well, tell us what change you're going to make, because right now it looks like he's made U-turns on lots of policies and he's not going to commit to supporting the people. He's even talking about even privatising the National Health Service, you know, and that was a Labour absolute flagship policy. And Mr. Keir Starmer maybe needs to take a look at that report that you're just quoting.
Thanks, Emma. Now, Greg, I was going to come to you for a little bit of historical perspective, please. One of the most significant misconceptions that the team's work in this report has revealed concerned the nature of support for centre-left parties in Europe. Social structures have been utterly transformed since the heyday of social democracy. Abu Chadi, the professor who founded this institute, said. He said, the average social democratic voter today is very, very different from 50, even 20 years ago. They're unlikely to be an industrial worker, for example. Now, he said that the data shows that much of this new constituency supporting centre-left parties are both culturally progressive and economically left-wing. So do you think, is there anything like enough recognition and appreciation that the social structures, and as a result, the voting patterns, look nothing like those of the 1970s and early 1980s? And to broaden it a little bit further, do you think, Greg, is that one of the, and I'm putting it in quotes, is that one of the successes of Thatcherism?
Well, that's an interesting expression of the successes of Thatcherism. Lovely one to finish off with, Andrew. I'll not go there, or if I do, it won't take long. Let's put a wee bit of perspective on this. I think maybe attitudes and understanding of what motivates people to vote and in which ways has possibly changed. I'm not necessarily convinced that the facts of what's happening in people's heads behind that has changed all that as much. It's just their understanding, maybe more. There was, I don't have the quote right in front of me. Wish I did. It was so good. But one of my favourite Irish journalists, referring to the referendum in Ireland and the repeal of a section of the Constitution which banned abortion, said that the youth of Ireland had started off with no presumptions in their campaigns, and they had decided to speak to people without presumption and try to win them over. Sometimes they got a severe knockback, other times they made inroads. But this journalist finished off by saying something along the lines of the idea that an old woman walking to Mass on Sunday would be automatically against abortion was one which assumed that she was deeply conservative in her views. And not only was that presumption wrong, but it was offensive. And no, many such people actually do hold very liberal views. It's just that we have a bias and an arrogant assumption against them. So in here, what we're saying possibly is that, there are people who have actually had I'll call them progressive views. I call myself alternatively a socialist or a social democrat. I don't care about the label, it's progressive. So it cares about the welfare of people who need a bit better care, bit help, bit looking after. The parties, can I start off with a little bit in here? This argument is often approached from two different camps, two different arguments. There's the pragmatic, there's the principled. The pragmatic camp would say, there's no point in talking politics unless you're in power because you can do nothing. You're just in opposition. And I've been there as a councillor as well as in administration. And therefore, you've got to keep on adjusting your policies until you're at the point where you can pretty well guarantee longevity in administration. And then you get power. Then you can think about what it is you want to do. Well, that's an interesting one. Wait till you get power and then decide what the principles are. That's one approach. The other one is that you start off purely with a principled viewpoint and narrow them down and say, well, we'll make no accommodation for anything outside our core beliefs. And by the way, we will never get to the point of attaining power. So the two extremes, one gains power for no reason, one never gains power because it has all the reasons. And somewhere in between the two is where we lie. And I think that there is so much spent these days in seeking to gain power without reason that people lose sight of what the reasons were behind your existence in the first place as a political party and as a candidate. And let me use the example in here, and I'm very proud of Scotland's stance on immigration. Immigration is shouted from all the headlines of the right-wing press. It's an assumption that immigration is horrible and destructive. No, it's not. In Scotland, it's an essential. And the SNP, fortunately, and others in Scotland, fortunately, are saying this is the road we're going to go down. It's one example of encouraging people who know that to be true, but think that they can't say it because it's wrong, because the press tell them that. It's encouraging them to open up and say, well, actually, I agree with that. Just like the old woman walking to Mass and then to the polling station in the Irish referendum.
Thanks, Greg. And Emma, I was going to ask you very much the same question, reflecting that your own background is both from a rural community and also the time that you spent in the United States. Do you think, is there enough recognition and appreciation that the social structures and as a result, the voting patterns that we see in Scotland and elsewhere in the world, that those social structures are completely different from the way they were in the 1970s and the 1980s?
Yeah, in my time in California, I worked at a big hospital. It was totally multicultural. I was embraced as coming from Scotland, and they were like, wow, you chose to come here. And so many people had actually our goals in the hospital are about making people's lives better, helping them with their elective surgeries or their emergency surgeries and things like that. Now, just like reflecting on kind of this, let's show what we have achieved and what the goal is of looking after people. How do we support people? Okay, we could create a social security system in Scotland that is the safety net when people need welfare support. We need to remember that, people are telling me, folk are going to move across the border and they're going to live in the south of the border next to Carlisle, and they might still work in Scotland, but so that they pay less tax, right? But they forget that what's happening in Scotland is, that the implementation of free tuition. I've got a list of 100 things that the Scottish National Party have achieved, because people will say, well, what have they ever done for us? Well, there's been a lot done to support improved housing and improved living standards and tackling poverty. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has said that the £25 child payment is a total game changer to tackle poverty in Scotland. And of course, basically the fact that universal credit was withdrawn has impacted that as well. But there's so much that has been achieved in since we established the Scottish Parliament, and then we've established 16 years of the Scottish National Party, where integration of health and social care is another one that it needed to happen, and now we're going to establish a national care service, and so the whole process of implementing policies that help people, baby box is another one, is the goal of how do we improve the lives of the people in Scotland. So there are many policies that affect people, whether you're a 17-year-old that's about to go into university, or whether you're a 70-year-old that's thinking about choices for support and care towards the time where you need maybe more support and care health-wise. So I think we need to look at we need to shout from the rooftops about what the Scottish Government have done, led by the Scottish National Party, so that we can help make sure that people understand that their lives are improved in Scotland compared to if they decided to move across the border, because they would definitely be negatively impacted if they did that. So there's so much that we need to be talking to people and engaging people and getting out there, and and finding out what their choices would be, because we seem to think that well, the policies that our people are choosing, this is why they vote for the Scottish National Party, is because they value the policies that the Scottish National Party and then the Scottish Government are taking forward. So I can send you my list of 100 achievements if it will help, but it's certainly something that I'll be sharing on my social media as well.
Of course. Thank you, Emma. Now then, we'd better get to our final item this afternoon, because time is against us as usual. But this week started with Humza Yousaf making a major speech on the economy in an independent Scotland at Glasgow University. And it ended with him launching the SNP's UK General Election 2024 campaign in Oranmore. With the Alistair Gray mural overhead for inspiration, the First Minister said, "Page 1, line 1 of the SNP election manifesto will say this: vote SNP for Scotland to become an independent country." Now, we've got a video clip of the First Minister speaking at Oranmore earlier this week.
Page 1, line 1 of the SNP election manifesto will say, vote SNP for Scotland to become an independent country. And why? Why? Because of our core belief that every decision about our country should be taken in Scotland. Because Westminster doesn't work for us, doesn't work for Scotland. And so that any elected Scottish Government has the full range of powers to build the kind of country, to build the kind of society that we know is possible. On the issues that concern most people, their standard of living, that need for independence has never been more urgent. Far too many people completely failed by this UK economy. Wages stagnating, inequality high, investment low. Both Labour and the Tories are committed to that Brexit-based economy, no matter what the cost is to Scotland. So on this most important of concerns, the economy and living standards, both Labour and Tories are offering more of the same. Economic decline, still decline, even if they manage it more competently. So for Scotland, it doesn't have to be that way. We have so many advantages. We all know massive renewable energy resources, world-leading universities, brilliant industries, our food and drink sector, advanced manufacturing, tourism, wonderful creative sectors. I could go on and on. And when we look at independent countries in Europe that are like Scotland, what do we see? Countries that are far fairer than the UK. Countries that are more prosperous, more wealthier than the UK, more productive than the UK. So with all of our advantages, with all of our human talent, all of our gallousness, why not Scotland?
There we are. That's a clip of the First Minister speaking at Oranmore earlier this week and launching the SNP's 2024 UK general election campaign. So, Greg, firstly, coming to you, it's not the first time we've heard the First Minister speak in those terms. So do you think, is the page one, line one, is that message getting through both to the electorate generally and also perhaps to sceptics in the independence movement?
Well, first of all, it's an absolutely essential message, and without that, the purpose, the raison d'etre for the SNP would be suspect. And it's delightful to see that is going to be the opening part of any manifesto. Is it getting through? Tricky one. The matter what is output, video, press release, whatever, to mainstream media, it will be edited down. And what's edited out is the problem in this. If you make a speech or write a piece which lists, which stays repeatedly, we need independence, then people sitting at home listening to that, their response will be, but why? But why? If you have a list of the achievements of the Scottish Government, then, and it could be a very lengthy list, rightly so, as Emma says, nonetheless, people at home would be saying, so what, so what? We've got to get the two things in there and try to avoid it being edited out. We've got to say what we have achieved, what can be achieved, what needs to be achieved, and the evidence to support that it can only be achieved through Scottish independence. But unless you join up all of those things, what we have done, what we need to do, and how we can do it, if you leave one of them out, you've broken the chain of logic, of argument in there. And how do we do that? Well, it's partly through programmes of this sort. But actually, the people who are listening to this programme know everything that I'm talking about. And if they think they don't know, well, have confidence. Come on, like the country itself, let's have more confidence. You've read, you understand the reasons why we need independence. And if the media aren't presenting it, other than media of this sort, they talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your workmates. Because that's actually how the argument gets won over. Nobody can edit out what you say to somebody in a conversation. They'll hear it. So you are the greatest promoters, you individually, the people listening to this programme, are the greatest promoters available of the cause for independence and winning people over undecided.
Thanks, Greg. And Emma, I was going to look at the politics of this a little bit with you. It's been said that the general election this year, if it happens, will be unlike any election in the last three that the SNP have fought. The 2015, 2017 and 2019 were defined by vigorous debates on constitutional change, independence and Brexit. Political contests that were fundamentally grounded in competing visions of power in the world and Scotland's place in it. Today, however, with 2/3 of Scots viewing the economy and the Tory cost of living crisis as their primary concerns, the battle lines for the next general election are already being drawn firmly in the material world, on the ground, in people's daily lives. So, Emma, is that what you're hearing on the doorsteps and in your mailbags?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to move away from the message of Scotland needs to be independent, and we need to say, well, why? And that is the messaging that needs to go out there, whether we send it to, like, speaking to folk on the bus, in the queues at the supermarket, speaking to our family, our friends, our neighbours. We need to, but this is the reason why we keep saying Scotland needs to be independent. And we know that if we elect Labour MPs in Scotland to go to Westminster, they're not going to represent the wishes of the 50% of the people in Scotland who want independence. They're going to be part of the UK Labour Party, because there is no Scottish Labour. Anna Sarwar has already retracted and reversed his statements, and Keir Starmer says whatever I say will be what Anna Sarwar says. So if we want people in Scotland to be represented at Westminster, they need to vote for Scottish National Party candidates. And for me, we've got real challenges in the south, because we've got 3 Tory MPs and 3 Tory MSPs, but we've got 3 fantastic candidates in David Wilson, Kim Marshall and Tracy Little, and I've been working with them and engaging with them and hearing about their campaign plans, and those guys are already working hard to help make sure that we turn the South yellow as well, and one of our candidates is already trending positively above John Lamont. So David Wilson is doing absolutely fantastic. So we need to value what the First Minister says, get it out there, talk about what he plans to do when Scotland gets its independence. Let's get back into the EU. He's talking about now creating a industrial strategy, and part of the government there will be a department for industrial strategy, because we need to have this process in statute where Scotland has a plan for our renewable energy, for our own Scottish electricity grid, the Scot grid. So we need to make sure that we are supporting the language that says, look, we can be an independent country and here's why. So that's what I'll be talking to people on the doors about, and trying to make sure that that message gets to everybody that I engage with as well.
Thanks, Emma. And that's a brilliant way to conclude our discussion on that last item this afternoon, because I'm afraid that's all that we've got time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We now urgently need to raise at least £10,000 to pay our bills within the next 7 days. We've already raised almost £2,000 towards that, thanks to the generosity of our supporters. However, we do need to raise the remaining £8,000 immediately if we're to be able to pay our bills and to continue making programmes. We expect it will be £7,000 by tomorrow, so please donate whatever it is that you can afford. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on X, Twitter, Mastodon and Blue Sky at Broadcast Scot. Please like, retweet, boost and reskeet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this afternoon, and of course I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guests, Emma Harper, MSP, and Greg McCarra. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Edinburgh is well known for its statues of animals, and on this day in 1872 saw the death of Greyfriars Bobby, the Skye Terrier, who's said to have spent 14 years tending his master's grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh. Please look after yourselves, keep safe and warm, and please have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.